Hi, in this video, I'm going to go over the last two stories in the original Thieves World anthology, as well as the essay at the very end called The Making of Thieves World. The first story in the book is called Myrtis. It was written by a name that I've never heard before called Christine DeWeese. Looking it up, there's not a lot about her online, but it appears that she's probably a pen name for Lynn Abbey. I'm not sure why Lynn Abbey used that name for this story, but I'm guessing that she didn't want her name all over the table of contents for a book that she also co-edited. The story focuses on a character named Myrtis, who is the madam of the Aphrodisia house. One day, she's just going about her business when Zalbar, who is the captain of the Hellhounds, which is the prince governor's personal guard, he shows up one day and basically tells her that the prince wants to impose a 10 gold piece tax on everybody that's working there. And this tax is going to apply not just to her brothel, but to every brothel. And he's going to come back in 3 days to collect. Myrtis is kind of the leader of all the different madams on the Street of Red Lanterns, which is essentially the red light district and sanctuary. And they all come running to her when they hear about this tax that's going to get imposed on them and all their workers. And they look to her for guidance. Based on what they talk about, Myrtis comes up with a plan. She's going to use her feminine wiles on Zalbar, the Hellhound, to try to convince him that the prince doesn't really need him to collect those taxes. The plan also relies on some help from Lythan the Magician, who is actually the main character of the next story in the anthology. To me, the story was just kind of so-so. It does add some information about the economics of Sanctuary, though I do think that Myrtis has a bit of an overblown idea of how important the red light district is, or the Street of Red Lanterns is, to the economy of Sanctuary. It does talk a little bit about the tunnels beneath the Street of Red Lanterns a little bit. Those were mentioned first in the story called Blood Brothers, which I reviewed in a previous video. Overall, I'd rate this story a 4 out of 10. The last actual story in this volume is called The Secret of the Blue Star, and it was written by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Now, Marion Zimmer Bradley is one of the most well-known female fantasy writers of the probably 60s through the 90s. I remember as a kid seeing a book called Mists of Avalon with her name on it in the bookstores every time I went into the bookstores. And that was probably there for like 2 decades that I kept seeing it on the shelves. So that's how popular the book was. The Secret of the Blue Star focuses on Lythan the Magician. It starts off with him running into Captain Vara in the Vulgar Unicorn. It seems to be like the first time they've ever met. Captain Vara actually tells Lythan that he's not the first magician with a blue star that he's ever seen in Sanctuary. This kind of freaks Lythan out, and once Captain describes the guy, Lythan gets really worried because it sounds like it's a guy named Rabin the Half-Handed, and that's a guy that is an old enemy of Lythan's. This is probably the most well-written story in the entire book, and it makes me want to read some of Marion Zimmer Bradley's other fiction. It gives a lot of background about the mysterious Blue Star magicians and the whole reason that their organization exists. And the story even has a wizard battle. All around, it's a good story, and I'd rate it an 8 out of 10. The last thing in this first Thieves World anthology book is an essay called The Making of Thieves World. It basically describes how Robert Lynn Asprin kind of came up with the idea, and then while they were at a convention one time, Gordon Dixon and Lynn Abbey suckered him into proceeding forth with it, and it became this big thing. There were a couple main rules that they set out, and that was basically each author would submit a character sketch, and any other author that was going to submit a story could use a different author's characters as long as they didn't kill that character off or make major changes to that character's personality. An artist named Jim Odbert told Robert Lynn Asprin that they would need a map for this thing because otherwise the continuity would be a real bear, and so Robert Asprin hired him to do the map for him. Asprin also had to field questions about Sanctuary, such as the deities, the economics, the architecture, and the nationalities of some of the names that people were going to use, among other things. At the time, Aspirin wasn't really that well known of a figure within the fantasy and science fiction world, but he was able to get some decently known names like John Brunner, Poul Anderson, Marion Zimmer Bradley, and even Philip Jose Farmer. All those people committed to writing stories. Bradley's story almost didn't get into the first anthology, but it made it to Aspirin for editing just under the wire. And Philip Jose Farmer's story actually ends up leading off the second volume, Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, because he wasn't able to get it to Aspirin in time to get into the first book. Gordon Dixon had a character named Jamie the Red who appeared in The Gate of the Flying Knives in this very first volume. However, looking through the table of contents of all the other 11 volumes in the original anthology series, it doesn't look like Gordon Dixon ever wrote a Jamie the Red story that was dedicated to be for Thieves World. I read somewhere that he used the character in a different series, but I'm not sure if that's accurate. It's an interesting essay, and it kind of shows some of the stress that editors must go through when they're trying to put together an anthology of original tales. Then when you add the fact that the authors are sharing characters with each other and sharing the setting, I'm sure it can be even more difficult when you're talking about continuity and locations and changes from one story to the next, and just keeping it all together must be a real bear. So now I've covered everything that was in Thieves World, the very first volume of the original 12 anthologies that were in the Thieves World setting. Based on the average ratings, when I take all the stories from this volume and average them together, the book deserves about a 7 out of a 10 rating from me. So that's pretty much all I have for this video. If you've got a TBR pile like mine, get to reading, because those books aren't going to read themselves.